Hi, so this is the second talk I published on YouTube. I'm going to talk this time about neuroscience and self-management. So essentially, what we know about how the brain works and what this means for you in your daily life. So to introduce, the talk I'm giving now is actually a subset, a topic, a specific subtopic of a book I just published about self-management. The book actually is a bit more general. It's not just about the neuroscience, it's about many other topics. So I'm going to try to hint at those topics, but I'm going to also try to not go too much off topic in this specific talk. Now, why is this talk relevant? Why is this actually a problem nowadays and we have to talk about it? Well, the thing is, you probably noticed already, we have two kinds of interrelated phenomena these days, which are the frenzied pace of life and the pandemic lack of time. Everybody knows this. The interesting thing is actually that there is actually research, sociological research, proving that this is not just a static pace, but it's actually accelerating. And so this is what Hartmut Rosas, the German sociologist, researched and found out. And it's actually one good way to think about this is like a hamster wheel. Actually, a hamster wheel is a very apt metaphor here because on this wheel, the hamster keeps running just to stay in place or walking. And actually, if the hamster wants to walk faster or run faster, it only does so, but doing so in itself makes it have to run even faster just to stay in place. So this is a good metaphor for this twisted self-accelerating system we built. In real life, why this is due to multiple factors, including sociological, economical, political factors. One very quick, basic example for this is email, for example. Email back then we developed as a sort of fast communication scheme to replace letters, physical letters. Now the thing is, at first, obviously, email sounded more efficient or faster than letter communication, and it is actually, but the catch is, back then when people used to send letters, they used to send 10 times fewer letters than using email. When we introduced email, we simply increased the amount of communication 10 times, and so the gains in speed by the communication medium actually resulted in very little time savings in the end, even maybe time losses. So this is actually a classical case of what's called Jevons paradox, in that if a resource is actually made more efficient, it ends up costing the same nonetheless because people simply use it more. So this is kind of the background behind this talk. Now, to start with, why these circumstances are actually relevant to the neuroscience is because for your brain, what this translates into is that we have a deluge of information nowadays. So a constant flood of input. And this is directly the consequence of the pace of life we have developed. Now, this has led the development of two different trends. So the first trend is that we have to handle everything instantly. So this is what brought us essentially the notification age. That the reason why you get a notification for something nowadays is because you're expected to handle it immediately and within a couple of minutes usually. And this is what David Allen mentions or likes to call interruptitis. It's like a disease essentially that is very modern, that affects modern organizations at least. And this is actually the situation in which you're constantly interrupted by new input, by new demands every other minute, essentially. And the other trend to this is that we shifted actually from outsourced services. For example, when we had a flight back then, we used to go to the travel agent to buy the whole package and for them to handle it. What we do nowadays actually is that we buy our own tickets, we book our own hotels, our own flights, trains, etc. And so these two trends developed simultaneously with this accelerating pace of life. And the problem is, if you run amok at the speed of life that we currently have, there are very bad consequences that can happen. So you can maybe understand from the picture that these are largely negative consequences. So you might be feeling overwhelmed. You might develop an inability to cope. Many people keep dropping the ball because of these constant demands, serially forgetting stuff, constant stress, and eventually burnout for many people. Actually, the burnout rates have been rising in Western countries for a while now. The problem why this is a problem is because few people know, first of all, how the brain works, and so they can't appreciate the perniciousness of these situations. And it's not surprising because unfortunately neuroscience is there is very little education about the neuroscience in our education system. So what I will try to do is I will try to give the basics in the neuroscience in the talk, and then base some specific recommendations or some specific conclusions based on the science. So the book I'm going to base this on is mostly The Organized Mind from Daniel Levitin, who is a New York Times bestseller. He's also the author of Your Brain on Music, for example, and he's very known, and he's a neuroscientist himself, so he knows what he's talking about when he wrote this book. Now, how do people handle information in this day and age? Well, actually, how people handle information today is outright the opposite of what the neuroscience would imply. It's actually flying in the face of neuroscience. Why? Is because, to give an example, for example, the brain has a limit of 120 bits per second. It can only process this much information. So if you think about this in the information age, how does this compare? In the information age, you keep receiving new emails, new SMS messages, new WhatsApps and whatnot. This actually translates into this sort of situation where it's as if you were using a fire hose to fill a water cup. So this is actually how fast the information is coming in and how little adapted our brains are to absorb these amounts of information. Now, about the neuroscience itself. The neuroscience has some basics by now. So the first of these basics is what they call the working memory limit. What is working memory? Working memory is essentially this type of memory that is short-term, that you use to pay attention to things, etc. The major finding in the neuroscience is actually that this working memory has a very small, very limiting number of slots. So it actually can only hold about 4 things at the same time. It depends on how you chunk the information also, but it's largely a very, very limited number. So remember that fire hose and the water cup I talked about. This is essentially how, this should give you an idea of how fast working memory can get filled up with new input in today's information age. The catch is if your working memory is actually occupied, this can lead to hindering your thinking ability and also your ability to make decisions, because for other reasons from other scientific fields, this is known actually that good thorough thinking is prohibited if you have an occupied working memory. So in the end, taking all of this into account, when you have 4 slots of information, this means that when you pay attention to something, you're actually really literally paying attention out of these 4 slots. So this is why it's very important to keep in mind that your attention is limited. It's very, very limited. Now, how does stuff get out of working memory? Let's say if you receive some input and new input comes in and these 4 slots are filled up. What does your working memory do? Actually, what it does is this. Either it deletes the information, so some of these slots, it just empties them to make room for new information coming in, and the old information is just trashed. You don't have any way to get it back in most cases. Unless it's important to you, in which case it moves to storage memory. So long-term memory, let's say. Now, if you're thinking that storage memory can help you keep tab on things, think again. Actually, storage memory, human storage memory, works entirely differently than what you might think. How human memory works is by association and triggers. So what this means is that memory relies on associating stuff, remembering or getting stimulated by something makes you remember something else that is related to it, and this is why it needs a trigger to remember things. So the trigger is precisely this, getting stimulated by the first element, which makes you remember some other things related to it. Now, human memory is very good at association, but it's known to be very unreliable at recalling stuff. And this is scientifically known. The specific issue is if you think that storage or long-term memory is good at reminding you of the right things at the right time and place, well, good luck with that. It's actually not going to do that. Actually, thinking that human memory is going to work for those things is a never-ending recursive logic. Because if you think about it, let me give you a ridiculous example here. Let's assume it rang 1:30 p.m. or it got to 1:30 p.m. and you had an errand to do. You will not just stop magically and think that, I had something to do at 1:30 p.m. Actually, the mere fact of remembering that you might have had something to do at 1:30 p.m. presupposes that you remember this thing's existence in the first place. And so unless you're keeping it constantly in your memory, your working memory, which is very limited, this is not going to happen. What's most likely to happen is that something happened, like for example, a clock ticked at 1:30 p.m., and then that was the trigger that made you remember that you had something to do. And so long-term memory is based on triggers. It needs reminders to be able to recall sets of information. The other side of the brain is that it has these two modes. So one is called focus mode, which is also called central executive mode, etc. And the other is this mind-wandering, creative, daydreaming mode. The brain either needs to be in this mode or that mode. So there is no other mode. It's actually either mind-wandering or focused or switching from this mode to that mode. So this is a kind of natural seesaw pattern in the brain that happens. Now, this is a natural tendency. The brain keeps moving between these two modes. This is fine. Although, by default, the brain will try to daydream. It will mind-wander, because that's the default mode of the brain. That being said, that's not the best mode. Actually, the happiest experiences happen in focus mode and not in mind-wandering mode. This is typically where the flow state happens, for example, where you're really engaged with something and you lose track of time. That's in the focus mode. Now, one interesting insight here is that a lot of creative insight or creativity generally happens when either switching between these two modes or when mind-wandering. That's actually a good source of creativity. So that implies that it's actually interesting or useful to collect these ideas when you're mind-wandering or when you're moving to mind-wandering mode, and then work on them or move on the ideas later when you're in focus mode. This is actually a good recipe for avoiding problems and solving problems. Now, on the other hand, your mind actually will have a natural tendency to mind wander to specific open loops in your life. So any issues, any problems you have, open projects, stuff you need to do, etc. And these will keep coming up every time you mind wander. So this is where protecting your attention comes in. Again, your attention is very limited based on what I just said. So the only way to prevent these open loops from coming and gnawing at your attention repeatedly is handling. I'll come back to this later. But essentially, this is one of the negative sides of this mind-wandering mode, is that you will keep, if stuff on your mind, they will keep gnawing at your attention and they will keep coming back to you in mind-wandering mode. And oftentimes they will actually snatch you out of your focus on something. And so you need to really think about protecting your attention with some tricks here. Now, one very important other aspect of the brain is this here, that mental context switching is actually very heavy. What I mean is this, is that mental context switching is, for example, imagine you're, for example, giving a talk like I'm doing now, and then suddenly somebody barges into the room, asks you about some report you wrote 6 months ago about a specific sentence and why you put that number, etc. It's not very difficult to imagine that you will need a minute or two to really grasp what the person is saying and come up with an answer. This is because switching mental contexts, thinking about completely disparate stuff, is actually heavy on the brain. When you're thinking about your family and then you move to thinking about a report somewhere, this is heavy on the brain to switch. Now, the switching is actually, it has very physical consequences. So it eats up actually energy in the brain, energy stores available to the brain. So the catch is, or the problem is, whenever you actually eat up or deplete those stores, your ability to think is hindered and you generally dumb down your thinking, essentially. So constant switching and multitasking, which is a specific form of this, is actually a very bad idea from this perspective. So the best is to actually have focused periods where you only focus on one thing, and then other break periods or leisure periods when your mind wanders. Just think about all sorts of things. This is actually why the notification and interruptitis age is has very bad negative consequences, because actually notifications keep switching you out of the context you're in. So this is actually why they're very bad, and the modus operandi we actually developed as a society is that we, again, treat these notifications immediately, and so if we keep switching to new context every time a notification comes in, well, it shouldn't surprise you that then you're depleted in the end of the day. Which brings me actually to discuss one other aspect of these energy costs. What actually, some other things that deplete these energy stores are decisions and willpower. This is actually a whole class of behavior sets, let's say, referred to as willpower. So what this means is that actually when you take a decision, or when you have to exert self-control or discipline to do something, this actually also eats up physical energy in the brain, so glucose, literally. The thing to remember here is that you don't have infinite energy in the brain. It's not as if you just have infinite stores. So eventually, you have to make do with the finite amount of energy, which implies that if you have costs eating up small portions of this energy all the time, you have a budget for these things. So it means you have a decision budget and a willpower budget. At some point, this will deplete. So this implies actually reducing the number of decisions you make in a day. This is actually, you have multiple tricks here. I will present some later. But the gist is you have to actually reduce the amount of decisions you take per unit time. This is because actually, if you don't do that, you will get to something that is scientifically documented. It's a state called decision overload, or ego depletion, called otherwise. What depletion means is this, is that you keep having to exert self-discipline or self-control or taking a lot of decisions until you deplete this budget I talked about. And if you deplete it, you actually lose your ability to self-control and think properly. So this is something you need to keep in mind. The other thing also I want to talk about the brain is that it has an inherent difficulty in prioritizing between decisions and tasks. This is actually known, especially if you're doing this live between many things. Why this is the case is because the brain has to assess a huge number of scenarios when it's doing this. So it's not just when you're deciding on doing something, you're not just deciding on doing it, you're actually deciding on not doing everything else. And when taking a decision, there are also other decisions that you could be taking. So every time you need to assess taking on a task or a decision, you have to evaluate a huge number of scenarios. Now, why this is a problem is because often evaluating these things actually in itself implies assessing relationships between more than 4 things. And why this is important is because your working memory, the thing you usually use mentally to assess relationships between things and pay attention to different things at the same time, is actually extremely limited. It's again about 4 things, just like I said before. So this is actually a very heavy task on the brain. So this implies that constantly redeciding on stuff and reprioritizing mentally is not a good idea. You really need at some point to reduce decisions, as I said, but also have external systems to prioritize. Maybe this is a bit difficult for high-level priorities, let's say, what does your family mean to you, etc. But for day-to-day priorities, this is actually very much needed. So you need external systems to manage this thing. So all of this being said about the brain, what is our modus operandi actually? Our modus operandi is that we actually don't even pay attention to these things. Many of these concepts are not even known. And so you shouldn't be surprised actually that the burnout rates nowadays are rising or alarming. It's because of this simple diagnosis. It's that because, again, we have a delusion of input and information, and then considering the neuroscience, this is actually exactly, we're handling them exactly in a way that goes against how the brain works. Namely that the neuroscience is very clear that keeping it all in your head is not a good idea. Your head is not made for managing these huge amounts of information. So, which brings me to what the neuroscience actually means for daily life. So, first of all, the basic premise is this. The premise is that the neuroscience, these concepts I just talked about, what they mean is that they imply the need for using an external self-management system, an external brain in some sort. So David Allen, the inventor of GTD, getting things done, he has a very nice saying here, which is actually truer than you think. That's that your mind is for having ideas, not for holding them. This is actually truer than you think. This is why actually neuroscientists like Daniel Levitin recommend time management as a way to avoid distractions. So this is what time management is for neuroscientists. So this can only be done actually if you have systems for deferring the thinking on distractions. So capturing input and avoiding handling it on the spot directly when you receive it, but handling it later, finishing the thinking on it later. So only if you have such external systems to handle these things can you actually allow yourself to ignore distractions. So which brings me to a couple of specific techniques to actually do this. So the first is exporting your thoughts, which I alluded to multiple times now. Why do you need to export your thoughts? Well, first of all, remember, we have a daily information bombardment. So essentially you keep getting bombarded every other minute by something new. And this is, again, too much simply for your brain to handle mentally on the fly. Remember that fire hose I talked about. So working memory is going to get filled up extremely fast with these things. And working memory is very limited. It's not something you have too much of. And the result is that if you don't adopt specific techniques, stuff are going to keep gnawing at your attention, which is, again, another word for working memory, because it gets filled up very fast. So stuff are going to keep coming back and forth, in and out of working memory and your attention. And so stuff are constantly going to be on your mind. So unless you have external systems, your brain is going to keep running around in circles trying to come to terms with this new input, what it means for you, what you should do about it, etc. And so for this, to counter this, again, you need good self-management systems, external systems to your brain. Which brings me now to the how. So what does exporting your thoughts actually literally mean? Well, first of all, it means noting down everything, which doesn't mean really literally everything. I'm sitting here and I'm not going to note down that the walls are white, for example. But noting down everything, especially that grabs any part of your attention. The reason for this is, again, the working memory and the fire hose. It will get filled extremely fast, and it's not made to keep track of these things, of the amount of things we receive nowadays. And then the other thing is that your long-term memory won't do to remember and keep tab on these things, because it's not made to exhaustively and accurately recall information. That's not how it works. It needs reminders. And it cannot be expected to remind you of doing something at a specific time. It's actually not going to do that, most likely. So the rule is generally that when in doubt, get it out. Whenever you're in doubt that something might be useful for later, or you might need to remember something about it, just note it down and get it over with. It doesn't mean that you need to write a report every time you get an idea, because if you do that, you're never going to get an idea, actually. Just scribbling something down very fast on a piece of paper is fine, as long as you come back later, not much later, to think about it. This is enough, actually, because if not a long time, if a small amount of time passes between the moment you note something down and the moment you come back to it to think about it, then your associative memory itself actually will work fine. Your long-term memory is going to use the note as a trigger, as a reminder that catches back the memory from long-term memory. So this is fine. A good trick here now to actually handle these exported thoughts is tagging the exported reminders. Why this is important is this. It's because tags actually are one way to increase creativity, or they actually map exactly to the creative functioning of the brain. The reason is because tags actually map exactly to associative memory. That's how they work. You associate something with a tag, and this is inherently how human memory works. So it's not by chance actually that Twitter and Instagram, etc., are so successful with these tags, because this is exactly how human memory works. It's extremely easy to enter them and get aware of them. Now, if you actually use these tags, what it will result in is that you're going to have a reminder system that works very naturally. So it reduces the friction and effort in managing these exported thoughts. Now, after exporting these thoughts, you actually need to also finish the thinking on the notes you've taken. So this is actually very important, especially to protect your attention. Why is, if you don't do this, if you don't finish the thinking on the stuff you noted down, they will eventually come back and gnaw at your attention because you didn't handle them actually when they occur to you. And so it's very important to actually finish the thinking because, again, attention is a very limited space. It has about 4 slots of information available. So you need to actually protect it. Otherwise, for your brain, it's as if not doing this, so not finishing the thinking, would be as if you actually took the notes and burned them down or threw them out the window. So it's only useful to do the note-taking, at least for the long term, eventually, if you actually handle the notes you've taken. Otherwise, it's as if you didn't even take the notes for your brain. So aside from protecting your attention, why it's very important to finish the thinking is to avoid this decision overload I talked about. The reason is, again, if you don't actually finish the thinking on something when you note it down or when it occurs to you, you will actually, what you will end up doing is you will end up constantly redeciding and reassessing it all the time. And so this constant decision making is actually a source of decision overload. And this is actually very negative for your brain. And eventually it makes you take bad decisions because it depletes your energy stores, your decision budget. And it also just generally makes your thinking very sloppy. And so it's better to finish the thinking on the stuff to avoid having them come back and gnaw at your attention and having you constantly thinking about and redeciding on them. Now, these two, so the exporting the thoughts and finishing the thinking on them, these are two basic fundamental building blocks behind these systems. Now, I have to compare this actually to a usual trick people use against these things, which is meditation. A lot of people think meditation is enough to solve these problems. Actually, it's not. The neuroscience is very clear. The story is much more complicated than this. And you have to remember there are no simple solutions to complex problems. So if you have a lot of problems in your life and stuff keep gnawing on your attention and stuff on your mind, it's actually a bit naive to think that a 20-minute break in a day, just merely noticing your breath is going to help. That's just wishful thinking. And it's a form of escapism. So there's actually otherwise a need from the neuroscientific perspective for specific measures and techniques like noting stuff down and not using your head to manage stuff mentally. Meditation is not going to work as well as exporting and thinking about these thoughts. Why? It's because it's the whole difference between treating the cause and treating the symptom. So these thoughts that occur to you and then meditation tries to, let's say, hold away. These are only the symptoms for bigger problems that are happening in your life. These are not root causes. So the root causes are the problems themselves. So only treating the actual problems will actually help you long term. Or it's the only thing that will make these issues not come back to your attention. So exporting the thinking and finishing the thinking, on the other hand, this is what is going to alter your conscious experience. So if you're looking actually for a really clear peace of mind, it's not via meditation that you're going to get it. It's by doing stuff like what I just recommended, or what I will recommend a bit later. So keep this in mind here when you're thinking about meditation as a recourse to these problems. Now, one other trick here is that maybe this is known already, is this 5-minute rule. This is a good trick you can use actually in light of the neuroscience to manage yourself a bit better. So essentially, you have to accept, first of all, that there is no ending of this flow of distractions. You can take a lot of measures to slow it down, but the amount of information nowadays is simply inherently much faster and much bigger than it used to be before. This is simply because of what I mentioned in the early part of the presentation, which is this self-acceleratory system. Now, the good thing is a lot of these distractions that come in, a lot of this information, it can actually be handled in less than 5 minutes. So it's not that important. Actually, a lot of it can be handled in less than 5 minutes. And so one good trick to use here for this information deluge is that anything that you can't focus on for more than 5 minutes, you either do in batch, later in deferred sessions, or you do on the spot if you have time and it's not distracting you from something else. And so this is actually one good way to fight context switching and fight and hold off distractions, because this is actually one non-consequential way. So if you do this, you're not just ignoring stuff coming in, you're just deferring the thinking on them for later, and for later processing in batch. And this is actually better from a context switching perspective, because if you're, let's say by definition, if you're doing these things in batch, the 5-minute stuff, you can't, 5 minutes is not enough time for you to go into deep focus on something. So if you're switching from a 5-minute nugget to another 5-minute nugget, it's not much of a problem, as if you're switching from a very heavy focused task to a 5-minute nugget. So actually, using this rule for later deferred handling is actually a good way to not switch yourself from whatever you're focused on. It will allow you actually to keep focusing on whatever you're doing and then just ignore these stuff for handling later. And one other good way this works for context switching, aside from distractions, is that it actually reduces the likelihood that you come to your to-do list and you pick something up only to find out that it took 5 minutes. And then only switch again to something else. So merely by the fact of handling everything in 5 minutes in batches outside of your normal day makes this out of the question. So it removes the chance of this happening. The other side of this is that this in and of itself, using the 5-minute rule, it's a good way actually to reduce the number of decisions you take in a day. Why? It's simply because of this. You're actually creating a pattern that goes like this. Essentially, if something takes less than 5 minutes, simply do. You essentially took a one-time decision for all of these simple nugget pieces. And so in the end, you save a lot of decisions, which is good from the decision-making perspective, because again, decisions have costs in the brain. You can't just take as many decisions as you want. This is what I mentioned earlier. And so there are obviously some exceptions here. If something might take less than 5 minutes, but you still shouldn't do it. For example, you shouldn't click the nuclear launch button just because it takes 5 minutes, But generally speaking, you can actually use this pattern to avoid a lot of decisions. Now, one other very, very important habit to adopt is stopping notifications. So again, as I mentioned before, due to the new pace of life we have a barrage of information coming in all the time. And this is coupled with instant handling standards. So if somebody sends you WhatsApp, they expect usually that you reply instantly, instant messaging. So this is actually a new standard that we as a society developed, but it's not something actually to be happy about. So I would advise that you don't accept distractions. This is actually, the notifications are actually a big source of context switching, which is very heavy on the brain, as I said before. The catch is the brain actually has a bias, an inherent bias for following the new. So it's actually, even though it's very heavy for it to switch context, it's still very well, whenever it gets a chance, it might take it. Whenever there is something new or shiny, it's actually going to follow it. This has multiple reasons, because back then when we used to walk on the savannah, tigers were lurking behind us to eat us. So it used to be actually very helpful to react to the very latest new sound from a potential tiger. But this put in the information age is completely inadapted. So the bias for new stuff. And so therefore, I would advise that you really stop notifications. I'm going to give you specific ways to do that. Now, one thing to keep in mind here is that this is on the receiving end, but you should also think about the sending end. So you yourself, actually, you should not rely on notifications yourself while dealing with others. So don't rely yourself on sending something via message and then expecting that it be read actually in 5 minutes. This is a custom you need, first of all, to drop if you're going to expect that others respect your mental space. And so very, very practical advice here is, for example, that if something is urgent and can't wait, just call, don't send a message. Just call directly, because it's now a long established custom since 100 years or so now, that if you call somebody, they will answer immediately. This is known, it's everybody knows it, there is no problem about it. Nobody is going to call usually unless it's urgent. Now, on the other hand, when something can actually wait, please don't call and just send a message, and don't expect that it would be replied to very fast. This is, first of all, on the sending end, so that other people can actually stop notifications coming from you. Now, as regards your actual situation, first of all, the no-go in terms of context switching is direct notifications. Anything that is, for example, a direct sound alert when a new Facebook post from a friend gets published. This is usually really better avoided. You're better off just switching these off on your device. So different devices have different settings for these. I'm not going to go too much into detail here, but there are many good ways on good smartphones to turn these off. Now, if you really need to, for some things, for example, for WhatsApp, etc., or SMS messages, there is generally a custom that you're gonna answer them within a day or so. At least if you stay 2 or 3 days until you answer them, that might be taken badly. So one way to actually still allow some form of notification there, but which is less disrupting, is only using indirect notifications. For example, if you have a smartphone, not have it send you a sound alert whenever you receive a message, but only having it show you the badge on the icon, on the app icon, such that you actually see the notification only when you go to look for it. So this is a good trick you can use actually to make notifications snatch you less often out of your focus. The general paradigm, though, is this. Why the indirect notifications are helpful is because a notification, every time it has information, the more information it has, the worse it is. Otherwise put, the less informative it is, the uninformative notification, the better it is. Because you don't have information to actually jump to. So essentially, if you, for example, receive an email, if you just receive a notification with the sender on it, then you don't know what the message is actually about. But if you receive the notification with the name and also the preview of the message, then it's much more likely that your brain will start thinking about the new stuff and snatch you out of your focus. Now, the last thing I'm going to cover here is a very important topic, which is single tasking. You might be thinking, why am I talking about single tasking? This is usually multitasking, which people talk about. Well, actually, yes, precisely, but that's why I'm talking about single tasking. It's because multitasking is actually simply an illusion. Human beings cannot actually multitask. This is just simply based on the neuroscience. What people do actually is that they actually keep switching very fast between things. So instead of doing 2 tasks or 3 tasks at the same time, they actually switch from the first to the second to the third, one after the other sequentially, and do this so fast that they have the illusion of multitasking. But this is actually source of a lot of problems and very depleting and heavy on the brain. Because again, as I mentioned before, this context switching and multitasking is very heavy on the brain. So it will result in mental exhaustion. And this is actually very negative for your daily life generally, because if you actually get to the state of mental exhaustion, you can expect actually, because of what I mentioned before about the budget and this being depleted, the cost and the decision budget getting depleted leads to loss of self-control and generally sloppy thinking. So you will have negative consequences because of this. Another side, if you just consider fun, let's say, is that multitasking actually will hinder your ability to go into a flow activity or into a flow state with whatever you're engaged in. So flow is this state where you're really lost in something, when you lose track of time. And this will be impossible to have when you're multitasking. So avoiding multitasking, the alternative is single tasking. That's why I'm recommending it. And essentially it goes like this. Essentially, you focus on a single task, and then you can mind wander, take a break, really just think about anything and everything, daydream, and then you focus again. This is actually the best way to use these two modes of the brain I talked about. So focused and then mind wandering and then focused. Follow the natural seesaw pattern and let it happen, but within the focus periods, only focus on one thing. So this is from the neuroscientific perspective I talked about before, the best way to work. That being said, so single tasking is generally the rule you have to follow. So not doing two things at the same time. There is, though, a sort of smart multitasking scheme that you can do. So what this is about is actually it's about brain dead activities. So for example, it's okay, and generally it's not much of a problem if you multitask between, for example, ironing some piece of clothes and listening to a low focus podcast or listening to a talk show. That's not much of a problem. You have to keep in mind, though, that multitasking is simply not possible when you're using the same brain resource. So for example, you can't watch a video and edit a photo at the same time. Your eyes are either here or there, or rather neither here nor there. So this is one way. The other example is, for example, you can't listen to a song or listen to a podcast and have a conversation with somebody at the same time. Your ears are either here or there. You get the point. So there are many examples here, but you simply can't use the same resource in two places. Now, that being said, even for brain dead activities, different people have different capacities here. So the first rule to follow is that generally nobody can actually multitask between more than two things. So even if you're thinking not just about ironing something and listening to a podcast, but also maybe, I don't know, listening to another podcast at the same time, this will not work. Or you can't iron and also wash the clothes at the same time and also listen to the podcast. More than two things are too much. But even within two things, so this ability to multitask between brain dead activities, this depends on the individual. So some people just can't do it. You have to keep that in mind. And also, even if they can do it, and generally for low focus and high focus activities, any activities that you actually multitask at, you're more likely to make mistakes. You have to accept that, and that's simply the part of the consequences of multitasking. The number of mistakes will go up, and so generally it's better to not do this when you're handling critical stuff. So this last habit being covered, here I want to give a more global picture. So these couple of tricks or habits that you can adopt, these are part of a bigger story. So the bigger story is self-management. How do you manage yourself? The catch is there are more tricks here than I can cover in a single talk. So this is why I have a book on the subject. Some of these things, for example, are an external dynamic priority system that automatically updates itself. This is actually needed if you remember what I talked about before about the brain's inability to keep deciding all the time and it having difficulty prioritizing mentally. Because we know the brain has these problems, it's better to actually, for day-to-day stuff, use an external priority system. One other trick here is doing reviews per topic, per tagged set of reminders. I'm not going to delve too much into detail here, but this is actually one good way to spark creativity, to also use associative memory in which is actually another word for creativity, in good ways. But for this bigger story is really in the book itself. So if you want more details, simply buy and read the book. Now, what's in it for you? So what can you expect actually as benefit if you actually adopt any of these practices? The benefits are actually many. So first of all, if you keep clearing your mental space, well, you shouldn't be surprised you're going to end up with a clear mental space. But you're also actually going to have much better sleep if you adopt such self-management habits, especially noting stuff down. Because when you're trying to sleep and you have insomnia, this is actually the typical scenario when stuff are on your mind. That's typically what actually stops you from sleeping. And so if you handle them outside your mind, this is actually a good way to allow yourself to sleep better and go faster into sleep. You can actually also expect less interference between things, so between activities. So for example, if you have a problem at work, it will be less likely to leak into your private life at home. And inversely, if there is a problem in your private life at home, it's less likely to leak into work. Generally speaking, also, it's just less stress and less suffering for you to handle these things in a self-management system as opposed to handling them in your head. You can do the same amount of work and the same things while suffering less. If you can do that, well, that's the better option. You can also expect that these habits will allow you to live in the present, especially clearing your working memory, because you simply are not in a state of really engaging with whatever you're engaged with in the present if stuff keep gnawing at your attention all the time. If 100 things are banging around in your head, it's not difficult to see that you can't focus on something. So the only way to live in the present is actually keeping your working memory clear, not meditation, for example. You can also expect actually that your creativity is going to be catalyzed a lot and helped a lot and boosted. You can expect to do better forms of procrastination. So actually recognize why you're procrastinating and deal with that effectively, and even procrastinate on purpose sometimes when it's actually the best way to go. Generally, you can also expect a better way to execute on your goals and to better achieve them. And also you make it more likely that you attain this flow state more often. So the flow state of being really engaged with something and losing track of time. Typically when people read or go to a concert, this same state actually can also happen when you're just simply focused on a specific task without any distractions. So these are less general things. On a higher level, you can actually expect specific self-measurement practices to help make your decision-making and judgment much better. And this is also based on the science reading and not just opinion. You can also expect to have better information processing ability. So, which brings me to one societal benefit of these self-management practices, and that they help actually fight fake news and sloppy thinking generally. There are many ways the self-management system I'm describing in the book helps against this. I'm not going to go into too much detail here. Your ability to think on higher levels is improved, and that's part of the reason why it makes it more likely that people can get out of this self-accelerating hamster wheel we live on nowadays. So generally, self-measurement practices here are the requirement before we start getting out of this hamster wheel. Only if we deal with the current situation can we actually improve it. So now, all of this being said, as a conclusion, so why it's important to give this talk, for me to give this talk, is that I noticed, even in educated circles, is that there is really a lack of neuroscientific knowledge. So the basic functioning of the brain is not even known by most people, not even in educated circles. And so this is actually a big problem, since the brain, if you think about it, is the single most important tool we use in our whole lives. And so not knowing anything about how it functions and how it should be used is kind of a bummer. We also have a delusion of information nowadays. A lot of stuff coming in, a lot of stuff we need to handle that means something to us that we have to do something about. And the neuroscience is very clear that keeping it in our head is not the way to go. It's definitely not the best way to handle it. But this is actually how most people work. And so you might think that there are better ways to function. The benefits of adopting these external systems are actually many. I just talked about them now. But they can be very, very profound. And so there is something in it for you, actually, if you, and not just idealism. You gain a lot actually by adopting these, by understanding the neuroscience and applying it in your own daily life. Now, for the whole story, you really have to, I would recommend that you read the book. There are many more topics related to the topic I'm covering here, namely sociology, philosophy, but also cognitive science and not just neuroscience, the science behind sloppy thinking, for example. And there are also more detailed descriptions of how to actually get started with this, what systems there are, what specific stuff you can do, and how to actually, from A to Z, get into better habits. This being said, I will thank you for your attention and for your time. I hope you enjoyed the talk.